The morning sun barely pierced through the heavy clouds as Officer James Cooper pulled into the police department's parking lot in his personal vehicle. The weather matched his mood, gloomy and irritable. At 42 years old, Cooper had spent 12 years on the force, and lately, every day felt like a battle against what he called the changing times. He slammed his car door shut, clutching his coffee cup while adjusting his neatly pressed uniform. His colleagues often joked that his perfectly maintained appearance was the only orderly thing about him. Cooper's temper had become legendary within the department, though his record remained relatively clean thanks to several sympathetic supervisors who shared his old-school mentality. Walking through the precinct's front doors, Cooper nodded curtly at Officer Sarah Martinez, a rookie he'd been forced to train last month. He still resented having to work with her, convinced she'd only gotten the job because of what he called the diversity hiring. The morning briefing room was already half full when he entered, taking his usual seat in the back corner. "Hey, Cooper," called out his friend and longtime partner, Officer Mike Sullivan. "Heard the rumors about the new chief?" Cooper grunted in response, taking a long sip of his coffee. The department had been buzzing with speculation about their incoming police chief for weeks. The mayor had kept the selection process unusually quiet, which only fueled wild theories among the rank and file. "Word is they're bringing in someone from outside," Sullivan continued, lowering his voice. "Probably another politician type who's never worked a real beat." Before Cooper could respond, Sergeant Peterson walked in, calling the room to attention. The morning briefing started as usual, reports of overnight incidents, updates on ongoing investigations, and warnings about troublesome areas in their patrol zones. Cooper half-listened while scrolling through his phone, a habit that often earned him dirty looks from supervisors. "One more thing," Peterson announced, clearing his throat. "The new chief starts today. We don't have many details yet, but expect changes in the coming weeks. Everyone needs to be on their best behavior." Cooper rolled his eyes, prompting a few knowing chuckles from nearby officers. He'd survived 3 chiefs during his career, each bringing their own revolutionary ideas that eventually fizzled out. This one would be no different. After briefing, Cooper headed to his patrol car, performing his usual equipment check with mechanical precision. His mood darkened further when he discovered his favorite cruiser had been assigned to Martinez for the day. He had to settle for an older model with squeaky brakes and a temperamental radio. "This department's going to hell," he muttered, adjusting his body camera with unnecessary force. The small device was another source of his constant irritation, always watching, always recording. In his view, it was just another tool for pencil pushers to second-guess real police work. As Cooper pulled out of the station, dispatch crackled over the radio with his first call of the day, a minor traffic accident downtown. He flipped on his lights, taking the familiar route while mentally preparing himself for another day of what he considered babysitting civilians. What Cooper didn't know, as he navigated through the morning traffic, was that his world was about to change dramatically. Just 3 blocks away, Dr. Victoria Washington was parking her unmarked car in front of a small coffee shop. The new chief of police had deliberately chosen to begin her tenure quietly, wearing civilian clothes and observing her department in action before making her presence known. Washington, with 20 years of law enforcement experience and a PhD in criminal justice, had reviewed every officer's file before accepting the position. Cooper's had stood out, not for his commendations, but for the disturbing pattern of complaints that had been systematically buried or dismissed. The paths of these 2 individuals would cross soon enough, but for now, Cooper continued his patrol, blissfully unaware that his antiquated worldview and unchecked behavior were about to face their greatest challenge. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the city's streets that would soon become the stage for a confrontation that would shake the department to its core. The day had only just begun, and Officer James Cooper had no idea he was about to become the catalyst for change he so desperately feared. Dr. Victoria Washington sat quietly in the corner of the bustling coffee shop, sipping her green tea and observing the morning crowd. She'd chosen this particular location because it offered a clear view of one of the busiest intersections in the city's downtown area. Her trained eye caught every detail: the way officers handled routine traffic stops, how they interacted with civilians, and most importantly, the subtle dynamics that spoke volumes about the department's culture. At 45 years old, Washington had earned every step of her journey to becoming chief of police. Growing up in a tough neighborhood in Detroit, She witnessed firsthand both the necessity of good policing and the devastating impact of bad officers. Her path hadn't been easy. Bachelor's degree, police academy, patrol officer, detective, commander, and finally earning her PhD while still working full-time. She pulled out a small notebook, jotting down observations while maintaining her cover as just another professional starting her workday. Her decision to spend the first week incognito had raised eyebrows among the city council, but Washington knew that real change required understanding the ground reality, not just reading reports. "More tea, ma'am?" the young barista asked, approaching her table. Washington smiled warmly. "Yes, please. And has it been busy with the police officers this morning?" "Oh yeah," the barista replied, lowering her voice. "Especially that Officer Cooper. Always complains about his coffee being too hot or too cold. Never tips either." This information didn't surprise Washington. Cooper's file had painted a clear picture. Competent at basic police work, but resistant to change, with a history of aggression toward minorities that had been repeatedly overlooked. She'd spent hours studying the pattern of complaints against him, noting how they'd been systematically buried by sympathetic supervisors. As she continued her observations, Washington noticed a concerning trend. Several officers seemed to handle white civilians with noticeably more patience and respect than people of color. It wasn't anything obvious enough to trigger formal complaints. The subtle differences were clear to her experienced eye. Her phone buzzed, a message from the mayor asking about her first-day plans. Washington replied briefly, reaffirming her strategy of quiet observation before making any major moves. She'd learned long ago that rushing into reform without understanding the department's dynamics usually led to failure. Through the window, she watched as Officer Martinez handled a traffic stop. The young officer's professional demeanor and respectful interaction with the elderly driver brought a smile to Washington's face. This was the kind of policing she wanted to see more of, firm but fair, respectful but effective. Washington checked her watch. Almost time for her scheduled meeting with the command staff. They were expecting to meet their new chief for the first time, but she had other plans. Her assistant would inform them that personal matters had delayed her arrival for a few days, giving her more time to observe unnoticed. Standing up to leave, she adjusted her civilian clothes, a simple business suit that helped her blend in with the downtown crowd. Her badge and credentials were securely hidden in her purse, ready if needed but out of sight for now. 20 years of undercover work had taught her the value of patience and careful observation. As she walked toward her car, a commotion caught her attention. Officer Cooper had pulled over a young black man in an expensive car, and even from a distance, his aggressive stance was obvious. Washington moved closer, her instincts telling her this situation needed watching. The young man was clearly frustrated but remaining polite, trying to explain something about his registration. Cooper's voice, however, was getting louder and more confrontational. Washington could see other pedestrians starting to slow down and watch, some already pulling out their phones to record. She knew she had a choice to make, continue observing or step in. As chief, her priority was preventing incidents before they escalated into viral videos and lawsuit material. But as an experienced officer, she also knew that sometimes the best evidence of a problem comes from letting it play out under controlled conditions. Washington decided to move closer, positioning herself where she could intervene if necessary while still maintaining her cover. Little did she know, this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would transform her department faster than any carefully planned reform initiative could have achieved. The morning was about to become very interesting indeed. The tension at the traffic stop was escalating quickly. Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old financial analyst, remained in his car with both hands visible on the steering wheel, just as his father had taught him years ago. Officer Cooper circled the black BMW like a predator, his hand resting unnecessarily on his holster. "I told you, officer, my registration is digital. I can show it to you on my phone," Marcus explained for the third time, his voice steady despite his growing frustration. "And I told you, I don't trust those fancy phone tricks." Cooper snapped back, his face reddening. "For all I know, you could be reaching for a weapon." Dr. Washington watched the scene unfold from about 20 feet away, her jaw tightening. The young man was doing everything right. Polite, professional, hands visible. Cooper's behavior, on the other hand, was textbook harassment under the guise of procedure. More bystanders had gathered now, phones recording the interaction. Washington noticed Officer Martinez pull up in her patrol car, parking quietly behind Cooper's vehicle. The rookie officer seemed unsure whether to intervene with her senior colleague. "Step out of the vehicle," Cooper barked, suddenly yanking the car door open. "Now." That was enough. Washington stepped forward, her heels clicking purposefully on the pavement. "Excuse me, officer," she called out in a clear, authoritative voice. "Is there a problem here?" Cooper's head snapped around, his eyes narrowing at what he saw as civilian interference. "Ma'am, step back. This is a police matter." "I can see that," Washington replied calmly, maintaining her role as a concerned citizen. "I can also see that this young man is being completely cooperative. Perhaps I could help clarify the situation." Marcus remained frozen in his car, eyes darting between Cooper and this unexpected intervention. Officer Martinez had stepped closer, her body camera clearly recording everything. "Lady, if you don't step back right now, you'll be joining him in cuffs," Cooper threatened, taking an aggressive step toward Washington. Washington stood her ground, decades of experience evident in her posture. "Officer Cooper," she said, reading his nameplate, "I'm simply trying to prevent an unnecessary escalation. The gentleman has offered to show you his digital registration, which is perfectly legal in this state." Cooper's face contorted with rage. The fact that this black woman knew the law and dared to quote it to him seemed to push him over the edge. "You think you know the law?" he sneered, moving uncomfortably close to her face. "You people always think you know everything." Officer Martinez stepped forward. "Cooper, maybe we should." "Shut up, rookie," Cooper snapped without taking his eyes off Washington. "This is how we handled these situations." Washington maintained her calm demeanor, though her expert eye caught every micro-expression crossing Cooper's face. She recognized the dangerous cocktail of anger, prejudice, and wounded pride brewing behind his eyes. "Officer," she said softly, "I'm simply a concerned citizen asking you to follow proper procedure. Your body camera is recording this interaction, as are several witnesses. Perhaps we could all take a breath and—" The next few seconds seemed to unfold in slow motion. Cooper's face twisted into an ugly snarl, and before anyone could react, he drew back and spat directly in Washington's face. The crowd gasped. Officer Martinez's hand flew to her radio. Marcus sat stunned in his car, witnessing everything. Washington didn't flinch. With deliberate calmness, she reached into her purse and pulled out a crisp white handkerchief. As she wiped her face, Cooper stood there, a smug smile starting to form on his lips. "Officer Cooper," Washington said, her voice carrying the weight of authority she'd earned over 2 decades, "I was hoping to observe the department quietly for a few days before making my presence known." She reached back into her purse, this time withdrawing her badge and credentials. "But I suppose now is as good a time as any to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Victoria Washington, your new chief of police." The color drained from Cooper's face as several things happened at once. Officer Martinez immediately stepped forward, positioning herself between Cooper and Washington. The crowd's phones captured every moment, and James Cooper, for the first time in his 12-year career, found himself completely speechless. The real storm was about to begin. Time seemed to freeze on that downtown street corner. Officer Cooper stood paralyzed, his face cycling through shades of red and white as the reality of his situation sank in. The badge in Dr. Washington's hand caught the morning sunlight, seeming to mock him with its gleam. "Chief, I didn't." Cooper stammered, taking an unsteady step backward. His usual swagger had evaporated, replaced by the terrified realization that he had just committed career suicide in front of multiple witnesses. Officer Martinez had already radioed for a supervisor, her voice steady but urgent. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247. Request immediate command staff to my location. Priority." The gathering crowd had grown larger, their phones still recording every moment. Some were already streaming live on social media, their excited whispers creating a buzz of commentary. "Did you see that? He just spit on the new chief. Oh man, he's done for." Marcus Thompson remained in his car, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and satisfaction. The situation had shifted so dramatically that he'd completely forgotten about his digital registration issue. Washington calmly tucked her badge away and pulled out a second handkerchief to finish wiping her face. Her composed demeanor only highlighted Cooper's increasingly erratic behavior. "Chief Washington, I can explain." Cooper tried again, his voice cracking. "I didn't know. You weren't supposed to be here until next week." "Officer Cooper." Washington cut him off, her voice carrying the weight of authority without raising its volume. "What you did was unacceptable regardless of who I am. Would it have been okay to spit on any other citizen?" Before Cooper could respond, 3 police vehicles arrived with lights flashing. Sergeant Peterson practically leaped from his car, his face ashen as he took in the scene. He received a frantic text from another officer who'd been watching the live stream. "Chief Washington," Peterson said, snapping to attention. We weren't expecting you today." "Clearly not, Sergeant," Washington replied, her gaze still fixed on Cooper. "Please secure Officer Cooper's weapon and badge. He's suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation." Cooper's hand instinctively went to his holster. "You can't do this. I have rights. The Union will be very interested in the multiple videos of you spitting on a civilian." Washington completed his sentence. "Not to mention your conduct during the initial traffic stop, which I observed in its entirety." Peterson moved toward Cooper, who suddenly looked like he might resist. Officer Martinez positioned herself strategically, her hand resting on her taser. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "James," Peterson said quietly, using Cooper's first name, "don't make this worse than it already is." Something in Cooper finally broke. His shoulders slumped as the fight drained out of him. With trembling hands, he unholstered his weapon and handed it to Peterson, followed by his badge. Washington turned to Marcus, who was still sitting in his BMW. "Mr. Thompson, I apologize for your experience today. Officer Martinez will complete your traffic stop professionally. If you'd like to file a formal complaint about Officer Cooper's conduct, I'll make sure it receives proper attention." Marcus nodded, still somewhat stunned by the entire situation. "Thank you, Chief Washington." As Peterson escorted Cooper to a waiting patrol car, Washington addressed the crowd of onlookers. "I appreciate everyone's concern, but we need to clear the sidewalk now." Her tone was firm but respectful, and people began to disperse, though their phones remained out. Washington knew the videos would be viral within hours. Her quiet observation period was effectively over, but perhaps this incident would serve a greater purpose. Sometimes the best reforms came from confronting problems head-on rather than trying to ease into changes gradually. She turned to Martinez, who stood at attention. "Officer, please properly complete Mr. Thompson's traffic stop. Then report to my office at 2 p.m. I'd like to hear your perspective on what happened here." As Washington walked back to her car, she could already feel the weight of the changes she needed to implement. Her phone was buzzing continuously. No doubt the mayor and city council had already seen the videos. This wasn't how she planned to start her tenure as chief, but sometimes the best plans were the ones that evolved from unexpected circumstances. The real work was just beginning. The police department's headquarters was buzzing with nervous energy. News of the incident had spread through the force like wildfire, and by noon, every officer, dispatcher, and clerk had seen the viral videos. Groups of officers huddled in corners, their hushed conversations stopping abruptly whenever someone new approached. In the chief's office, Dr. Washington sat reviewing the multiple angles of footage captured from body cameras and civilian phones. Each viewing reinforced her initial assessment. This wasn't just about Cooper's actions, but about a deeper cultural problem within the department. "Chief," her assistant called through the intercom, "the mayor is here with the police union representative." "Send them in," Washington replied, closing her laptop. Mayor Richardson burst through the door, his usual polished demeanor slightly frazzled. Behind him, Union Rep Frank Dawson followed with a stern expression set on his weathered face. "Victoria, this is a disaster," the mayor started, pacing the office. "The video has over 2 million views already. News vans are parked outside the station." Washington remained seated, her calm presence a stark contrast to the mayor's agitation. "With all due respect, Mayor, this isn't a disaster, it's an opportunity." "An opportunity?" Dawson scoffed. "Officer Cooper has 15 years of service. He deserves due process, not a public lynching." Washington's eyes narrowed slightly at his poor choice of words. Mr. Dawson, your officer spat on what he believed was a civilian. Would you prefer we discuss this incident's implications for the department's broader culture, or would you like to focus on defending the indefensible? The union rep shifted uncomfortably. Even he had to admit the videos left no room for interpretation. What's your plan? The mayor asked, finally taking a seat. Washington opened a folder on her desk. Officer Cooper's personnel file shows 7 complaints of excessive force against minorities in the past 3 years. All were dismissed by supervising officers without proper investigation. Those complaints were handled according to procedure, Dawson interjected. A procedure that's about to change, Washington stated firmly. Starting today, all civilian complaints will be reviewed by an independent board. Additionally, I'm implementing mandatory de-escalation training and cultural sensitivity workshops. The mayor leaned forward. The budget will be reallocated from the department's military equipment fund. Washington completed his thought. We need fewer armored vehicles and more community policing resources. A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Martinez entered, still in uniform from her shift. You wanted to see me, Chief? Washington gestured for her to sit. Yes, I'd like you to tell these gentlemen exactly what you witnessed this morning, particularly about Cooper's behavior before I intervened. Martinez straightened in her chair, her rookie status not preventing her from speaking truth to power. She detailed Cooper's aggressive approach, his refusal to accept digital documentation, and his escalating behavior toward both Marcus Thompson and Washington. As Martinez spoke, Dawson's face grew increasingly concerned. The mayor stopped pacing and listened intently. Thank you, Officer Martinez, Washington said when she finished. You showed good judgment today. I'm putting you in charge of helping implement our new community outreach program. After Martinez left, Washington addressed both men. Gentlemen, this incident will either be remembered as the day this department began real change, or the day we proved we're exactly what our critics say we are. The choice is yours. The mayor sighed, recognizing the political reality. What do you need from me? Your public support for the changes I'm implementing, an assurance that the city council won't interfere with departmental reforms. Dawson stood up, straightening his jacket. The union will fight this. The union will adapt, Washington corrected him, or find itself defending increasingly indefensible positions in the court of public opinion. Times are changing, Mr. Dawson. We can lead that change or be dragged along by it. As both men left her office, Washington turned to look out her window at the news vans below. She could see officers trying to avoid the cameras, some looking up toward her office with uncertainty. Her phone buzzed, a text from Marcus Thompson thanking her for her intervention and expressing hope for real change in the department. Washington smiled slightly. Change was coming, ready or not, and she was just getting started. The disciplinary hearing room was packed to capacity 1 week after the spitting incident. Officers lined the walls, some supporting Cooper, others there to witness what they suspected would be a historic moment in the department's history. The local media had been barred from entering, but sketch artists sat in the front row, their pencils moving rapidly across paper. Officer James Cooper sat at the defendant's table, wearing his civilian clothes, a ill-fitting suit that made him look smaller than his uniform ever had. His union-appointed attorney shuffled papers nervously beside him, well aware that this was an unwinnable case. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Chief Washington entered the room. Instead of taking her usual seat at the disciplinary board's table, she walked to the witness stand. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was unprecedented, a police chief testifying in person at a disciplinary hearing. Let the record show, the board chairman announced, that this hearing is regarding the conduct of Officer James Cooper on February 15, 2025. Chief Washington has chosen to testify as the primary witness. Cooper stared at his hands, unable to meet Washington's steady gaze. His attorney stood up, tugging at his collar. Before we begin, the attorney said, my client would like to offer his resignation from the force, effective immediately. Washington raised her hand. I'm afraid I can't accept that, Counselor. This isn't just about Officer Cooper's employment. This is about addressing systemic issues within our department. She turned to address the room at large. In preparing for this hearing, I reviewed every complaint filed against Officer Cooper. I spoke with citizens who had encountered him. I watched hours of body camera footage. What I found wasn't just one officer's misconduct. I found a system that enabled and protected bias. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Several senior officers shifted in their seats, aware that they had dismissed complaints against Cooper over the years. Chief Washington, the board chairman began, please describe the events of February 15th. For the next hour, Washington methodically laid out every detail of that morning. She described Cooper's aggressive behavior toward Marcus Thompson, his escalating anger, and finally, the moment he spat in her face. Her testimony was clinical, precise, and devastating. But what concerns me more, she continued, is that Officer Cooper felt comfortable enough to behave this way in broad daylight, in front of witnesses. That speaks to a culture that needs changing. Cooper's attorney attempted to argue that his client had been under unusual stress, that his record showed years of commendable service. But each defense fell flat against the wall of evidence Washington had assembled. As the hearing proceeded, Washington revealed her true purpose. She wasn't just prosecuting Cooper. She was putting the entire department's culture on trial. Every dismissed complaint, every overlooked incident, every example of bias was laid bare. Therefore, Washington concluded, I am not recommending Officer Cooper's termination. The room erupted in surprised whispers. Cooper's head snapped up, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time. Instead, Washington continued, silencing the room, I am implementing a new program. Officer Cooper will be suspended without pay for 6 months. During this time, he will undergo intensive bias training, perform community service in minority neighborhoods, and work with our new Civilian Oversight Committee. If he successfully completes this program, he may return to modified duty. Cooper's attorney leaned over to whisper in his ear, but Washington wasn't finished. Additionally, every officer who supervised Cooper and dismissed legitimate complaints will attend the same training. We're not just removing one officer's bias, we're addressing the system that allowed it to flourish. Several senior officers stood up and left the room, their faces red with anger or shame. Others sat straighter, recognizing the opportunity for real change. This department has a choice, Washington concluded. We can continue defending the indefensible, or we can become the model of what modern policing should be. Officer Cooper's actions gave us this opportunity for change. It's up to all of us to make that change meaningful. As the hearing adjourned, Cooper remained seated, looking shell-shocked. He had expected to lose his job. Instead, he had become the unwitting catalyst for departmental transformation. Washington gathered her papers, knowing that the real challenge was just beginning. Change wouldn't come easily, but it would come. She had made sure of that. 3 months into his suspension, Officer James Cooper sat nervously in the community center of the predominantly black neighborhood he once patrolled. As part of his rehabilitation program, he was required to attend weekly community meetings and participate in outreach programs. Today's meeting was different. Marcus Thompson, the young man he had harassed during the infamous traffic stop, was scheduled to speak about his experiences with law enforcement. Cooper had tried to get out of attending, but Chief Washington had made it clear this was non-negotiable. Good evening, everyone, Marcus began, standing confidently at the podium. Some of you might recognize me from that viral video 3 months ago, but what happened to me that day wasn't unique. It was just finally caught on camera. Cooper shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Marcus recounted not just their encounter, but a lifetime of similar experiences. The financial analyst described being pulled over 17 times in the past year alone, despite having no traffic violations on his record. From her position at the back of the room, Chief Washington watched Cooper's reactions carefully. She had designed this program to create uncomfortable but necessary confrontations with reality. The goal wasn't to shame officers, but to help them understand the impact of their actions. Officer Cooper, Marcus said suddenly, making direct eye contact with him, I know you're here tonight. Would you be willing to come up and have a conversation with me? The room fell silent. Cooper felt dozens of eyes on him as he slowly stood up, his legs feeling like lead as he walked to the front. This wasn't part of the program. Marcus had gone off script. I don't know what to say, Cooper admitted, his voice barely audible. That's okay, Marcus replied. Just listen. Then maybe we can talk about why you saw me as a threat instead of a person that morning. For the next hour, Marcus and Cooper engaged in a raw, honest dialogue. Cooper spoke about his upbringing in a small town, his limited exposure to diversity, and the departmental culture that had reinforced his biases. Marcus shared stories about teaching his younger brothers how to survive police encounters, the constant anxiety of driving while black, and his hope for change. Washington noticed something shifting in Cooper's demeanor as the conversation progressed. The defensive posture he'd maintained for months began to relax. His responses became more thoughtful, less rehearsed. "I never thought about it from your perspective," Cooper admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "We're trained to see threats everywhere, but maybe we're creating the very tensions we're afraid of." After the formal meeting ended, Washington watched as Cooper and Marcus continued talking in a corner, their body language suggesting a genuine connection had been made. Other community members gradually joined their conversation, sharing their own stories. Later that evening, Washington sat in her office reviewing Cooper's progress reports. His mandatory counseling sessions showed improvement, and his community service supervisors reported increasing engagement. But tonight had been different. Tonight she had witnessed genuine change. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Thank you for letting me go off script tonight. I think it made a difference." Washington smiled, remembering her own journey in law enforcement and the moments that had shaped her understanding of community policing. Real change couldn't be forced through regulations alone. It had to come through understanding, through human connection. She pulled up the draft of her new departmental policy, which would require all officers to participate in regular community dialogue sessions. Cooper's experience would serve as a pilot program, demonstrating that even the most resistant officers could learn and grow when given the right opportunities. The incident that had brought them all here, that moment of rage and disrespect captured on dozens of cameras, had transformed from a scandal into a catalyst for genuine reform. Cooper's journey from defiant defender of the old ways to someone who was beginning to understand the need for change was becoming a powerful example within the department. Washington added a final note to Cooper's file: "Shows genuine progress in understanding community impact. Recommend continuation of program with increased responsibility in community outreach initiatives." Outside her office window, the city lights twinkled in the darkness. Somewhere out there, Marcus and Cooper were both heading home, both changed by their encounter today. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was real progress. Sometimes, Washington reflected, the best changes come from the most unlikely sources. 6 months had passed since the infamous spitting incident, and the police department's lobby was packed for an unusual ceremony. News cameras lined the back wall, and community leaders filled the front rows. Today marks not just Officer Cooper's return to duty, Washington began, but a new chapter in our department's history. What could have ended in termination became an opportunity for transformation. Cooper looked different now, his stance less rigid, his eyes more thoughtful. The past 6 months had changed him in ways none could have predicted. He had completed not just the required training and community service, but had voluntarily extended his involvement in several neighborhood programs. Marcus Thompson sat in the front row, now serving as the chairman of the newly established Civilian Oversight Committee. His presence was a testament to the unexpected bridges that had been built during Cooper's rehabilitation period. "Officer Cooper," Washington continued, "would you like to share your thoughts?" Cooper stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously. Gone was the arrogant officer who had once patrolled these streets looking for confrontation. In his place stood a man humbled by experience and educated by understanding. 6 months ago, I was the perfect example of everything wrong with policing," Cooper began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I saw threats instead of people. I used my badge as a shield against change. And when confronted with my own prejudices, I responded with anger and disrespect." He paused, making eye contact with Marcus before continuing. "The easy thing would have been to fire me. I deserved it. But Chief Washington saw an opportunity to address not just my actions, but the culture that enabled them." Throughout the lobby, officers who had initially resisted Washington's reforms listened intently. Many had gone through similar training programs now, though none as intensive as Cooper's. "Today, I return to duty as a different officer," Cooper continued. "But more importantly, I return as part of a different department. We're learning to be guardians of our community rather than warriors against it." Washington stepped forward again, Officer Cooper will be assigned to our new Community Integration Unit, working directly with neighborhood leaders to build trust and understanding. His experience will help train other officers in bias recognition and prevention. The ceremony continued with the formal reinstatement of Cooper's badge, but with new conditions attached. He would remain under supervision, continue attending community meetings, and serve as a mentor for the department's reform training program. After the ceremony, as people mingled and cameras packed away, Cooper approached Marcus Thompson. "I never properly apologized to you," Cooper said quietly. "Not just for that day, but for all the others like you I treated the same way." Marcus extended his hand. "The best apology is changed behavior. Keep doing the work, Officer Cooper." From across the room, Chief Washington observed their interaction with satisfaction. The department's latest statistics showed a significant decrease in complaint filings, and community satisfaction ratings had improved dramatically. Other police departments had begun requesting information about their reform program. Later that evening, Washington sat in her office, reviewing the day's events. On her desk lay Cooper's final evaluation alongside proposals for expanding the reform program department-wide. What had started as a crisis had evolved into a model for police reform. Her phone buzzed with a message from Cooper. "Thank you for not giving up on me. I won't let you down." Washington smiled, remembering her own mentor's words from years ago. "Sometimes the hardest cases become your best success stories." Outside her window, Cooper was leaving the building, stopping to chat with community members who had attended the ceremony. His interaction was natural, respectful, a far cry from the hostile officer of 6 months ago. The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the street where everything had changed that February morning. In the warm evening light, Washington could see officers and civilians talking together on the steps of the precinct, a simple sight that would have been unusual just months ago. Change was happening, not through force or fear, but through understanding and opportunity. The department was becoming what it should have been all along, a true partner in community safety and trust. As Washington gathered her things to leave, she knew that while this chapter was ending, the real work of maintaining and expanding these changes was just beginning. But for the first time in her long career, she felt genuinely optimistic about the future of policing in her city. Sometimes, the worst moments really do lead to the best outcomes. The end.